Good morning and welcome, and thank you all for joining us on this lovely Friday morning. I'm Molly Ramsdell, Director of the Washington Office of the National Conference of State Legislatures, the bipartisan organization serving the legislatures of our nation's states and territories and commonwealths. I want to offer a special thank you to our legislators who were able to join us today to discuss the important work in their states on prescription drug pricing and transparency and share their perspectives on what is happening nationally. Joining us today are Representative Tom Oliverson, Vice Chair of the Insurance Committee in the Texas House of Representatives, and to his right, Delegate Bonnie Cullison, Deputy Speaker Pro Tem with the Maryland House of Delegates. Let's give them a round of applause. Thank you. In addition to taking part in this morning's briefing, Representative Oliverson and Delegate Cullison are also making the rounds on Capitol Hill and meeting with senior policy advisors at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Some of the items they are discussing include the need to reform federal patent laws to address the impact it has on the cost for biopharmaceutical medications, proposed reforms to the FDA orphan drug program, the creation of the first ever Prescription Drug Affordability Drug Board, and surprise billing issues as it relates to prescription drug costs. I hope you all enjoy today's discussion. I know I'm looking forward to it. And a quick reminder that there will be time later in the program for a question and answer period with the legislators. I will now hand the program over to Hayley Nicholson, Senior Director for Health and Human Services at NCSL. Hayley?
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for my multiple welcomes. So we're going to just jump right in. We're going to have Delegate Cullison go first. We have her presentation, and we're happy to share afterwards if you'd like a copy. I know there's some copies of some other stuff that we have here today. This session will also be recorded, so if you have colleagues that would like the link to the recording, please let us know. As Molly said, we've been meeting with congressional staff. We're going to be meeting with officials from HHS, staff from there today as well, and they've been doing a great job, but also more importantly, doing a great job in the states on these issues that are so critical, and we hope this can help push our federal partners into getting prescription drug legislation that will be beneficial and bolster their efforts. So with further ado, I will hand it off to Delegate Cullison.
Thank you, Hayley. Thank you all for being here this morning. Thanks for helping us to kind of tackle these issues as we try to make sure that our consumers, constituents, friends, neighbors, and family are able to have good health care. And so I know that pharmaceutical drugs is something that everybody was really thinking about and coming this morning, but I'm really proud of my state of Maryland, in that we've been tackling this issue of affordable health care for a while. We were very encouraged with the passage of ACA. We're very discouraged by what has happened to the ACA over the last few years. So we've put some programs in place that I just wanted to run through really quickly before we get to the prescription drug issue itself. So if you, and I apologize for the slideshow. I am not the technological wizard. I'm not sure why the right-hand side is cut short, so pretend it's there. I think you should be able to fill in those words there. So here's kind of a history that we have of things that we've done in order to make sure that Marylanders have access to affordable health care. We have an innovative program that began in 2014 called the Total Cost of Care. I'm going to talk about that in a second. We've got a Healthcare Protection Commission. We established a reinsurance program. We started this year an early enrollment program for insurance, and then our Prescription Drug Affordability Board. So the all-payer model, go ahead. The all-payer model, basically what that did in 2014 was give hospitals a global budget. So, and we did this in with a contract with CMS, and basically what we said to hospitals is, this is how much we will pay you. And if you maintain and try to keep costs down. So what it did was decreased the need for readmissions. Hospitals became very conscientious about making sure that people didn't have to come back for services because they weren't going to get any more money. And when those people came back for services for the same thing. So it was a program that worked really well. CMS was very satisfied with it, and you'll see a little bit later, was renewed the program. Then when we started seeing the changes in ACA, we said we need to figure out as a state what we can do to protect our citizens. And so we set up a Health Insurance Protection Commission, very diverse. You can see it has legislative representatives, it has physicians, it has carriers, it has consumers, and they meet every other month to talk about how do we put some of the best parts of the ACA in our own language, in our own statute, to make sure that those protections are going to be there. And you can see its charge is to monitor the changes to the ACA and evaluate the impact. And so one of the things that came out of that commission was a reinsurance program, because our health care premiums were through the roof. Our we have two carriers only two. This is a problem. We're going to deal with this. Only two on our healthcare exchange. And in 2016, they came to the Insurance Administration asking for a 90% increase in premiums. And that is just untenable. So the Insurance Protection Commission came up with the idea to request a 1332 waiver in order to establish a reinsurance program. We did that in 2017. Our insurance premiums have gone down 32% in the last 2 years because of the existence of this program. Go ahead. And our all-payer system morphed into something called the total cost of care. We negotiated again with CMS. So now, in addition to the global budgets, we're incentivizing hospitals to work with community providers so that the services that might have been delivered in hospitals at much higher and more expensive rates can now be delivered in community services. We're also contracting with primary care doctors under this model to make sure that the chronic diseases are taken care of at the primary level, and they're not going to our EDs, and they're not going staying in our hospitals. We have to demonstrate that we can save $300 million in Medicare expenses in the next 2 years in order to continue this program. We're already more than halfway there, so the program is working. This is something that is brand new as of January, this January, when a Marylander fills out their tax form, they're going to be able to check a box that says that a member, myself or a member of my family, did not have health insurance in this tax year. Checking that box is not required. It is completely voluntary. This was in lieu of a mandate. The commission considered an individual mandate for Maryland because, think about it, that's what caused the premiums to increase to some degree, was the changing of the pool. The folks who were well were not coming into the insurance market anymore once the federal mandate wasn't being enforced. So we thought about a mandate. People don't like it. So we were looking for something that was more positive, it's more proactive. So the early enrollment program allows people to identify themselves as needing insurance. If they say no, we do not have insurance, they are then able to check a box giving the Maryland Health Benefit Exchange permission to access their tax records. And if they do that, then the exchange will tell them whether or not they're eligible for a subsidized program. We believe, right now we have, by our records, about 300,000 uninsured Marylanders. We believe about 170 of them would qualify for highly subsidized programs. They just don't know. They don't know that they're eligible, and they don't know how to access it. So for this year, the exchange will just tell them you are eligible and we can help you. In 2021, the board will be able to auto-enroll folks into a program if they're eligible. So we're a brand new program. We're really excited that it's going into place. So the thing that I think you're here to talk about or listen to today is about the Prescription Drug Affordability Board. And I have to tell you, this was not my individual bill. I did not sponsor it. However, as the chair of the insurance subcommittee, I was responsible for defending it on the floor of the House. I have never studied so hard in my life. Well, with the exception perhaps of the defense of my master's thesis. But other than that, I mean, I had a 3-inch binder filled with facts and figures and reasons why this board could work. And it was, and you can see it is a truly bipartisan product that we're very excited about. So in terms of thinking about the board, what I suggest is that we understand the fundamentals, look at the interactions between the players. We had to learn from our own past experiences, which were a real problem, and then just recognizing the balances that we have to strike as we consider this kind of legislation. Okay. So the fundamentals begins with public sentiment. I'm sure if you live in the United States, you have heard about how the cost of prescription drugs is a real problem from all citizens. So coalitions were gathering. We have a advocacy coalition called Healthcare for All. They gathered over 127 other advocacy coalitions in Maryland to advocate for this board, for us to do something about prescription drug costs. And one of the things that is hard to understand is how actual drug pricing is done. And I was just telling someone earlier that I had somebody come into my office 3 years ago and try to explain it to me and left me with a piece of paper with lines all over it that were connected but had no rhyme or reason. And so it's a very complex process. I know I spent some time with my committee making sure that they understood who all the players were in this process. And then to understand the relationship between drug costs and healthcare costs overall. We had to understand who these folks were, who were in the chain. We addressed 3 of them. One were the pharmaceutical companies. And I'm going to say that in a public hearing, I asked a representative from a manufacturer, so you have no role in setting the prices of your product? And I was told no, that it was all done downstream in the chain. So I was a little surprised by that. What Pharma said to me is, we want transparency, but a lot of our information is proprietary, so we have to be careful about what's out there. And then the poor pharmacy benefit managers, the guys with the targets on their back, and in all the commercials that you see, and I'm not saying it's not warranted, but I do say they are a legitimate part of the chain that were actually created as middlemen in order to administer the sale of pharmaceuticals between carriers and manufacturers and wholesalers. So let's, I'd like to take the target off and to see them as just part of the chain. In the discussion, the insurance companies were very low-key, but they just kept telling us, we got to solve this problem because it's causing our rates to be too high. In 2017, we passed a price gouging bill. And it was only for generics, and it basically said anytime a generic cost went up 200%, then Maryland would cap the price. Well, there's 2 problems with that. One, you can't, under commercial law, you cannot single out a single product, and generic was considered a single product. And also, it is also illegal to cap prices. So in a national business. So one state can't do it when this business is national. So we went to court. That bill went to court and was found to be illegal. So we knew that we had to, that we had to do something about that. We also understand that a lot of the information is protected by trade law. A lot of the information in terms of the production of pharmaceuticals. So, you know, we have to understand that balance and what could be protected and what could be public. So we established in 2019 the Prescription Drug Affordability Board by statute. And we said this board was going to make decisions about how drugs are bought in Maryland. And in the discussion around the bill, there was lots of discussion between the Senate and the House around who would actually make those decisions. You know, would it be this board? Would it be the legislature? Who was gonna do it? In the House, we wanted the board to do it. In the Senate, they didn't. They didn't know, you know, they said, that's not gonna work. We didn't want it to come back to the whole legislature, because imagine having a discussion about a price of a single pharmaceutical on the floor of the House of Delegates in Maryland. Not a pretty sight. So what we settled on was our Legislative Policy Committee. That includes all of the leaders of both the House and the Senate. So our committee chairs, our Senate president, our speaker, and a representative of the governor. So that's the actual body that will be making decisions. We also have to think about balancing that free market. You know, we are not, and the public interest, we're not about not allowing companies to make profit. We understand people are in business to make profit, but we've got to consider how, where the balance is. And so I think that's really important. Next. So what is this board? It is a completely independent agency. We modeled the legislation after our healthcare exchange, our health benefit exchange. So it is accountable only to the legislature. And it's composed of 5 members, all of whom have to have some background in health economics or healthcare. So these folks are all, you know, have a level of expertise. The board chair is appointed jointly by the Speaker and the Senate President. The board chair, the current board chair, who was just appointed in November, is a former Secretary of Health in Maryland. And it is advised by a stakeholder group, a stakeholder advisory group. And if you look at the legislation and you watch the amendments, it started out at 21, it went to 22, it ended up at 26, because we wanted to make sure that all the voices were heard. So you have the board, you have its advisory committee. Go ahead. So what it will do is it will have the ultimate authority to recommend upper payment limits. Now, understand that upper payment limits means that's what the state will pay for that drug for its state and local government employees. It's not a price cap. It is what we as a state think is a fair price, making sure that all the folks in the chain get a share of that for that particular drug. And that's the recommendation they'll make to the Legislative Policy Committee ultimately. But there's some work to do before that. What it's going to do is it affects 4 kinds of pharmaceuticals. One that starts out at $30,000 a year. So a lot of your biologics are going to fall under that. Name brand drugs that increase by more than $1,000 cost per year. Generics that cost $100 now, but see a $300% increase. Those will come under scrutiny. And then we put in there if it creates an affordability challenge for our residents. Part of the role of the board in its organization over the next year will be to define what an affordability challenge is. So once the board identifies a product it wants to look at, it's going to be working to gather information. The statute is very, very clear that all proprietary information remains confidential. So, you know, they will be asking the drug companies, the PBMs, the insurers to give them information about contracts between them relative to the pricing. And all of that proprietary information will remain proprietary. Anything that can be public will be public. We have in the law that we will be working with other states, establishing MOUs with other states and who are already gathering information, and that we'll share that information where appropriate and what can be done under the trade standards. We're going to compare, or we're not going to, the board is going to compare the cost, you know, of similar drugs. That's just one of the things that's going to go into their thinking, and then they'll make a recommendation to the Legislative Policy Committee. One of the questions that came up on the floor a lot was, what if there's a shortage of a drug, and that, you know, of course, elevates the price? The law addresses that by saying any drug that is on the FDA's shortage list would not be subject to an upper payment limit. So we tried to address it that way. Okay. So the board had its first meeting on January 13th. So, you know, just sort of an organizational meeting. It is currently in this year, in this year it's funded by the Department of Health, but because it's an independent agency, it can't remain that way. So one of the major roles of the board this year is to find a way to fund itself. A bill is coming forward, and we've worked with the pharmaceutical companies and the PBMs and the insurers and the wholesalers to say everybody in the chain has to pay a little bit for this board. We're thinking it at the most has about a $2 million budget over the course of a year, and we think that with all the players in the chain contributing, and you know, so far there's been a willingness to do that contributing, then we'll be able to fund the board. They have to set up a plan to focus to do a focus study on what drug pricing is right now, how they affect insurance premiums, and what the trends are. In 2022 is the first time they can make any recommendations about potential upper payment limits. And then for state employees. And in 2023, we've asked them to come back to us and say whether or not they think this could be expanded to the commercial market. So, you know, we've got a timeline of things the board is going to do between now and then. So, you know, people ask me all the time, what do you really think this board is going to do in the end? And you know, what's the real potential for upper payment limits? I don't know the answer to that question, but I think what it will do is hopefully straighten out the lines on that piece of paper that I was shown 3 years ago, and that there'll be a direct relationship between the cost to produce the pharmaceutical and what everyone is getting along the chain related to what the consumer experiences in the pharmacy, and with respect to their health premiums. So I think in the end, the best, you know, one of the first and best things this board can do is clarify that process for us all, which at this point is not really transparent to anyone. So we are optimistic and think that we have something here that is worth pursuing, and everyone is behind it, and now we're watching to see what happens. So with that, thank you very much for your attention. I'll turn you over to Representative Oliverson.
All right. Thank you, Delegate Cullison. I appreciate that. Good morning, friends. I am Tom Oliverson. I am the Vice Chair of Insurance in the Texas House, and it was my distinct honor and pleasure to be the author of a very timely piece of legislation in Texas, House Bill 2536, which is our Texas solution to combating rising drug prices in Texas. Now, full disclosure, I am a physician. I'm actually an anesthesiologist by trade, which means that I'm pretty good at putting people to sleep, sometimes just by talking to you, but if that fails, I always have stronger measures available. But hopefully not today. So I got interested in this issue, like I think many of you did, because I think we can all acknowledge that prescription drugs are one of the fastest growing segments of healthcare costs. And one of the things that frustrates me as a provider and also as a patient is that despite our best efforts over the last 30 years, we've actually done precious little to actually bend the cost curve down on medical costs in general. So that was my initial interest. Now, I also got a sort of a big jolt when I sat down with TRS, which is our teacher retirement system. It's the largest health plan in the state of Texas, many millions of subscribers, participants. And they informed me that their drug spend was going to triple over a 4-year period from 2018 to 2022, increasing by a total of $1 billion just on pharmacy. And of course, that really sort of lit a fire under me in terms of my efforts of trying to attack this problem, because that clearly is unsustainable. We can't have a tripling of our pharmacy spend every 4 years, especially since TRS not only is that sort of a commercial plan and is managed by a PBM and an insurer, but it also relies on payments from our Texas legislature and budget, as well as our teachers, who are not necessarily the most wealthy or well-off folks trying to make ends meet, and we're trying very hard as legislators to prevent prodigious increases in their annual premiums that don't correlate very well with their salaries. So that was sort of the jumping off point for me. Now, as a doctor, let's go to the next slide. Yeah, so as a doctor, as I began to approach this problem, the first thing I thought about was when we try to solve problems as physicians, as medical folks, we don't begin with treatment. We begin with diagnosis. And so I was surprised, even though, so as a physician, I am sort of an end user of the pharmacy supply chain, right? I'm the guy that uses the drugs in the operating room or writes the prescription. I was shocked when I, as a legislator, when I started talking to folks at how long and complex the pharmaceutical supply chain actually is and how many different players are involved between the manufacturer and the patient who's actually the consumer of the product. It was staggering to me. And the other thing that disturbed me rather mightily was as I sat down with each of these groups and asked them, you know, try to get a sense about, well, what do you do and what do you think is causing these prescription drug prices to be so high? This was universally what I got. It's not us, it's them, right? And so everybody's pointing the finger somewhere else, and that was particularly disturbing to me. So I said, okay, being the good, clinician that I am, I said, let's gather some information, let's find out. So, next slide. We'll skip ahead on that one. So what we did, actually, that's okay, they're a little out of order, but that's okay. So what we did then is we looked at the idea of transparency. So if the problem is that the prices are going up, you have all of these players in the system, nobody wants to take ownership over who's responsible for these price increases, the safest course of action from our perspective was let's require some reporting of information from each of the key stakeholders and let's find out where along the way these prices are jumping. And perhaps we can figure out why. And so that's where House Bill 2536 came into play. And what we did is, so we didn't, I don't think we're the first state to look at these thresholds and triggers. There are other states that went before us looking at this, but we sort of hit upon the idea that, there are three main players in this space. There's the manufacturer, obviously has some responsibility for setting the wholesale acquisition cost for any drug that they're selling. There's a pharmacy benefit manager. I like to refer to them sort of as the Jerry Maguire of the pharmaceutical supply chain. They don't make anything, they don't insure any risk, they just negotiate, right? And I would point out that there are 3 companies in control of 70% of that market share, and all 3 of them are in the Fortune top 50 wealthiest corporations in America. So Jerry Maguire is doing very well in the pharmaceutical supply chain. And then you obviously have the insurer, who often contracts with the pharmacy benefit manager, and I think what we're all seeing now is that there's vertical integration between insurers and PBMs, such that, you know, sometimes the PBM owns the insurer and sometimes the insurer owns the PBM, but essentially they're part and parcel of the same financial house. So those were the 3 things that we wanted to focus on, and you can see what 2536 does is it basically is broken into 3 pieces, requiring some basic reporting from each of those 3 stakeholders. And so we'll move on here to the next slide because I kind of just want to get into the specifics. So let's talk about pharmaceutical manufacturers. Obviously, they're the ones that decide what the wholesale acquisition cost is. And so what we wanted to know from them, first of all, as a baseline, was what is the wholesale acquisition cost of every drug you manufacture and is available in the state of Texas? And we wanted that information updated annually. And then on top of that, we said if you raise prices beyond a certain point, and this was sort of a bone of contention that we negotiated back and forth and, you know, tried to work out, and I would say in full disclosure, we settled on 15% in 1 year or 40% over 3 calendar years successively, but I don't know that there's a magic number for that. And I would be the first to say, and as we took this law and later, you know, introduced it at the National Council of Insurance Legislators for model policy, that was one of my main points to folks was there is no magic number here. It may be higher, it may be lower as a threshold in your state, but the important thing is to have a trigger some point that requires a little bit more onerous reporting requirement. I get many justifications for why prices might have to go up. My thought was, fine, just put it on paper. We want to know what the reason is, and we want to be able to show that to everyone else in the world. And so really the reporting requirement when you get above the 15% concerns information like what was your research and development costs for the preceding year aggregated? What were the names and values of any drugs that you manufacture that were became off patent in the preceding calendar year? And also an explanation of what factor or factors led to the need to increase the price above this threshold. And so those are the requirements for the manufacturer. Let's move on to the next slide. The PBM. So the pharmacy benefit managers really have 2 main levers when it comes to how they help control costs. One specifically is their interaction with the pharmacist, which is sort of what the pharmacist gets paid for filling the prescription. That one, from what I've been able to gather, didn't seem to be as big of a deal in terms of contributing to the cost, the actual wholesale acquisition cost of the drug, because that's obviously determined before the pharmacist actually gets a chance to fill that prescription. So the real issue then, it comes in terms of negotiated rebates, payments, fees, things that the PBM is able to extract from the manufacturer in order to have that drug placed on the formulary in a preferential position, which is good for the manufacturer because that means they sell more drug. And look, that's a private negotiation. That's something that 2 for-profit entities enter into an agreement to try to work out. We were clear that we were not trying to destroy or disrupt that negotiation process. We think that free markets work in Texas. Our economy is proof of that. But at the same time, we also wanted to get a handle on where there's some abusive practices going on here. And so with respect to the PBMs, what we really wanted to know was, what are you getting from the manufacturer in total? Rebates, price protection payments, fees. What is the manufacturer giving you in exchange for this drug being put on the formulary so that we could then backtrack to the wholesale acquisition cost and make some potential inferences about what effect all of these protection payments and rebates had on determining what the wholesale acquisition cost is to begin with. And then furthermore, and very specifically, we wanted to know what percentage of those payments in aggregate was being retained by the PBM as revenue versus how much of that was being passed through to the consumer. You may be aware, I'm sure most of you are, that that's been sort of a focus of the FDA and the Trump administration recently is making sure that more of these rebates are making their way down to the consumer instead of being retained as revenue. So we wanted reporting of that information. We'll go to the next slide. And the insurers, they, I don't know that they necessarily have as much of a role in terms of that negotiation between the PBM and the manufacturer. I think is really the critical piece. But the health insurance plans are a source of very good, useful information for a state that's trying to get a handle on which prescription drugs are going up in price and why. And so the health insurance plans report just some basic data on price increases, which drugs are being prescribed, which drugs have utilization management requirements on them, particularly specialty drugs, and what is the effect of utilization management in terms of cost containment. So those are the kind of measures that the plans would be reporting. Now, I will say that for all three of these segments and reporting requirements, we tried to pay very careful attention to the fact that, as I said, we understand that these are private negotiations between two for-profit entities engaging in free market commerce. We in Texas are not in the business of publishing all of your proprietary confidential information so that your competitors can prey upon you. And so all of these reporting requirements, when they get to the commissioner before they're released to the general public, have to be aggregated in a way that doesn't tend to disclose the actual contractual relationship between manufacturer A and PBM Z, or health plan Q and PBM R. So we didn't want to get into that kind of nitty-gritty detail. Now, you could make an argument, and I think it's a valid argument, that if you're really trying to get as much information as you possibly can to try to lower prescription drugs, it might be useful to force everybody to report very specific, detailed, confidential, contractual information so that you could get to the root of the problem more quickly. That was just something that we felt in Texas was certainly would have solved the problem, but the cost benefits analysis, it would have been so destructive to the free market and in terms of encouraging innovation and research and development and all of the things that go on in this marketplace. We didn't want to destroy the marketplace for the sake of transparency. So we kind of had to draw the line there somewhere. So our bill is now law. It has been implemented. We expect that the first data call from the Texas Department of Insurance concerning the pharmacy benefit managers in the health plans should be completed by the end of the first quarter, and we will have a report published soon thereafter. The manufacturers reporting to HHSC. HHSC is working on their part and developing a portal for reporting. That process is still ongoing, but we expect that that will be completed very soon. And so I would expect that by the end of the year, we can confidently say that at least for Texas, we should have some very good detailed information out there and available. What does this give us at the end of the day? I would say it gives us really two things. I think the thing that folks are hoping for is that manufacturers and other stakeholders may seek to avoid these reporting requirements by simply staying below the thresholds. And in fact, that was one of the things I heard is say, well, 15% is too high. You have to make the manufacturers report at 5% or anytime there's a price increase or 10% or whatever. But we're also requiring them to tell us what the wholesale acquisition cost is year over year anyway. So we'll know if folks are intentionally trying to just fly below the radar screen by increasing their prices 14.999%. I don't really think that's going to happen. But we'll see, and if it does, then we will address that. But I think the more important thing is this aggregated information may not necessarily be something that the consumer can take to Walgreens or when they're shopping for an insurance product and say, well, I want to go with plan, X here because they have a cheaper price on this particular prescription that I take, and so that's what I want. That wasn't the objective here. The objective here was to get a more global picture of where costs go up in this entire chain, so that hopefully folks like you all, folks like us, folks like researchers and policy analysts who are busily thinking about what is it that we can actually do to bend the cost curve down, investigative reporters who make a living trying to ferret out some of the details of why is this a problem and what can be done. Again, going back to my medical training, we're gathering information so that we can make a diagnosis. And once we've made that diagnosis, then the next step is to prescribe treatment. So I would just be here to tell you that this is probably step one. And as this information rolls in and we start getting a clearer picture of where these price increases are coming from and who is responsible, then it will be much better, much more effective, and much easier to prescribe a laser-focused treatment to actually deal with those specific problems. But it only works if I have the participation of all of you working alongside with us, folks like AARP and folks like the pharmaceutical industry and the media and think tanks like the Brookings Institute and USC and Yale researchers and folks who really focus on these things. I'll need you to help us interpret this data so that we can arrive at the right conclusions and thus prescribe the appropriate treatment. And with that, I would just like to thank the staff at NCSL, Margaret and Hayley, particularly very grateful that you guys have taken the last day and the day today to let us both go up to the Capitol and talk to our federal lawmakers about what it is that we've done. I will tell you, as a state legislator, one of the things is you do something really great in your state and you're trying to get the feds to notice, and you're saying, hey, look at me, I'm over here, I did this great thing, I know you're working on the same problem, but I want to tell you what I did. And so I'm just really grateful for the opportunity from NCSL to be able to come up here and share with y'all our Texas solution to pharmaceutical price transparency. Thank you very much.
Okay, I'm going to kick off with a question, and then we can go to the audience. And if you have a question, just come forward. I'll bring you the microphone and just identify yourself when you ask a question. So for both of you, federally, this issue has surprisingly been largely bipartisan for the most part, this and surprise billing and prescription drug costs and overall healthcare costs. Did you work with your colleagues on the other side of the aisle, and what did that process look like? And then also working with the administration in your state around these issues. I think sometimes our federal partners, they get feedback, but sometimes it's only from the administration level or from the governors. We're trying to change that. And so if you could just talk about kind of those experiences on the ground for both of you.
All right. Thank you, Hayley. Yeah, in Texas, this bill passed unanimously. It was very, very bipartisan. I had joint authors in both chambers, Republicans and Democrats, working hand in hand to get this done. And I would just say that on a lot of these issues, surprise medical billing, same thing. We had very strong bipartisan support. These are issues that are timely. I think we can all recognize that they're literally killing all of us at the pocketbook level, and the current trajectory is wholly unsustainable, and the time to act is now.
Right, so Maryland is a very heavily Democratic legislature. However, we did work very closely with the leaders of the Republican minority in crafting this legislation. The bill itself ended up being bipartisan in terms of co-sponsorship, but the leadership of the Republicans could not sign on to the bill because of the concerns about the constriction on businesses. And so they are willing to say, we want to, we knew it was going to pass. We're going to take a look and see how it works. We're going to be, watching it carefully. If there's any abrogation of any commercial rights or any of the issues around proprietary information, we're going to make sure that that's going to be stopped right away. But and people said, everyone agreed we needed to do something, and since we didn't have another ready answer, and this is a a program that's been discussed for about 2 years within Maryland, it was worth taking a chance on. And like I said, it was the bill itself was bipartisan, but not the actual in negotiations, if you will.
And at the end of last year, Congress had planned to pass a bill related to this and surprise billing and some other issues. That was stalled, and now they have a deadline they've put on themselves of May 22nd, and it was announced in the House about 2 weeks ago that they want to get that moving well before May, and some of the folks that we met with yesterday in the Senate said the same thing. So what are your top recommendations for federal legislation that deals with these issues?
I think my number one recommendation would be, no need to reinvent the wheel. I mean, I would look to states like Maryland, like Texas, who have attacked this issue head on and have succeeded in passing things with, large bipartisan margins of support. In Texas, I would point out that both of these pieces of legislation that you mentioned, the surprise medical billing piece that Senator Hancock and I passed, as well as my price transparency bill, these were bills that not only passed with huge bipartisan margins of legislatures, but essentially had unanimous consent amongst the stakeholders as well. And so I think it is possible to design solutions that kind of gets everybody on the same page. I would just say that at the federal level, I'm not sure that they've actually hit on that right formula yet, but they could certainly look to the states to provide examples of what's actually working well.
And I would agree. I think the representative's analogy around diagnosis and treatment is spot on. And so my recommendation to the federal government would be to engage very deeply and independently and in a bipartisan manner in determining, diagnosing the problem and looking at the transparency, and then bringing everybody together. And I mean all these players. I mean, every piece of the chain has a role. And so bring those parties together to talk about, and including consumers, to talk about what are all the possible options, that we're not limited to one option. We're not limited to upper payment limits. There are other ways to address this issue, but let's bring parties together who can bring those options to the table.
To the audience, does anyone have any questions? You come up. You do, because we're recording this, so it'd be great if, and it just where you're from.
I'm Tara Ryan. I'm with the Association for Accessible Medicines. We manufacture generics and biosimilars. And I guess my question is, first I want to thank both of you. I think Maryland and Texas have gone very far in trying to figure out how to address what is a very, very complex issue. And I did a lot of work in Maryland. I'm a Marylander. I did a lot of work in Maryland with the leadership of Healthcare for All and the legislature in Maryland. We were not as engaged in Texas. And I guess one of my questions is, as you become leaders across the country and how other states are looking at how to address this very complex problem, our concern is that looking at Texas specifically, when you're looking at the language and the requirements for manufacturers, when I listen to discussions about this, I hear the word manufacturer as if generic manufacturers and brand manufacturers are the same. And although all the players in the system are the same, how we interact in the system is very, very different. A 15% price increase on a $10 drug is very different than a 15% price increase on a $10,000 drug. So I guess my concern is, as we're thinking through legislation, and I think Texas is already being considered as a model on the transparency side across other states, a lot of the brand manufacturers, the big brand manufacturers, have already made a commitment to not increase their prices more than 10%. So if brand manufacturers aren't increasing their prices more than 10%, and you're going to get a lot of data on low-cost generics that have increased their prices 15% or 40% over 3 years, is that data going to be meaningful for the state? I guess that's, so I think what Maryland did in the legislation that they passed, which is different because it's not just transparency, but they also included a study on how the generic pharmaceutical industry works, because it is so different, and we don't pay rebates and we don't get preferred placement based on the rebates. I think the question then becomes, should we be differentiating the triggers or the thresholds for reporting so that the state is not collecting a lot of data, volumes of data that probably won't be so meaningful, because she'll be collecting a lot of data on price increases that don't impact either patient out-of-pocket costs or whatever the state is paying. I guess that's, for you in Texas, I wonder if that's something that we should be talking about. A long question, but.
No, I think it's a great question, and I would just say that I think one of the things I didn't mention, but is definitely worth bringing up, is one of the other components of our Texas laws, that there's a price threshold below which the medicine doesn't qualify for reporting at all. And the reason for that is simply that when we're dealing with the constraints of a state budget that's trying to be fiscally responsible to the taxpayers, it is very, very easy in this reporting, to your point, to end up reporting so much information that it requires an army of statisticians at the state agency level to be able to compile all of that data and push it out there to the public. And then, again, to your point, you know, so in some cases it may not necessarily be super useful information. I think the generic issue is a different issue on some respects. I ran across some information out of the Brookings Institute a week or so ago, which shocked me, reporting that in fully a quarter of prescriptions filled in America today, it's cheaper to pay cash than your copay. And I would be willing to bet that 95 to 100% of those cases are all generic drugs. So we have a whole other problem going on with the delivery system that we have with respect to generic medications, and that is limitations on a patient's knowledge, ability, and availability to simply bypass the traditional insured system altogether and simply to just pay as you go, which probably would save the average consumer a tremendous amount of money. And so that, again, is something that we need to look at. So it's a great question.
Anyone else? Any questions?
Hello, I'm Karina Patel from Biogen. So we're a biotechnology company in Cambridge, Massachusetts, focusing on neuroscience research, so Alzheimer's, ALS, Parkinson's, and those diseases. Can you describe a bit more about how an MOU would work as it was envisioned in the Maryland law, and how it would work with states that have already passed transparency laws? Thank you.
Thanks for the question, and thanks for your work. You know, it's very timely. And I do appreciate, and those of us in Maryland do understand the research and development aspect of the pharmaceutical industry and how important it is. So we believed in Maryland that there are other states who are trying to deal with this problem, such as Texas, and that they've already begun to gather information. So it would be that our board would actually reach out to the appropriate governmental agencies in the appropriate states, and that the MOU, it says clearly in the statute that the proprietary information, you know, is clearly identified as such, and that information would never become public, and then clearly identify what is public and can be public, and the board will use that information appropriately. And it's our assumption that the MOU would be a sharing between Maryland and the other state. And when I met the representative last night, I said, well, I can immediately recommend to our board chair that he go to Texas because they'll be gathering information that we would find very important in the work that the board's doing. Does that help?
Yes. Do you expect to see a change in states not looking to pass transparency laws if they can do something like a board and do an MOU to get that information?
I think that states will pass laws that get them the information. So I don't think that our MOU process will preclude that in any way, because they're going to want to make sure that it's done in the way that is appropriate for that particular culture and community and state. Yeah.
Oh, right here.
Good morning. Elaine Ryan with AARP. Thank you so much for your leadership. I think this demonstrates that these issues are not Democrat or Republican. They're really consumer issues, and RX really threatens the future of affordability for healthcare. So thank you for your leadership. My question is on price gouging. It was mentioned that Maryland did pass a price gouging bill that was challenged and struck down. What are your thoughts about future legislation in that area, or legislation that might directly address rising drug costs for all consumers?
Thanks, Elaine. I think we're going to let the board engage in its process. The board reports to the legislature every year, and if we see that there are some real anomalies or things that in their reports that are going to cause us to say we may need legislation that addresses things, prices in a different way. But we are not looking to change anything right now. We're willing to wait a year or two to find out how the board works and what information it brings back to us. Mm-hmm.
Elaine, appreciate your question, very timely. And look, I think the answer to your question is that's one of the reasons why I'm here, is because my answer is essentially that I think federal action is necessary. My understanding of price gouging and the examples that have been put to me and the things that I've seen is that the most egregious price gouging pretty much only occurs in an area where there's exclusivity on manufacturing. And so my solution, very simply, would be that price gouging results in automatic loss of exclusivity. And I do think that, I understand that sometimes price increases are necessary and reasonable. And I am not at all here to suggest that I think that pharmaceutical research and development and manufacturers should be a zero-sum game. I want to encourage that research. I want to encourage that development. But I'm particularly troubled and disturbed by some of what I would call funny business that seems to happen, around things like the orphan drug program. There clearly are abuses in that program. There clearly are situations where having patents on a medication turns into what I think lawmakers here refer to as a patent thicket, which essentially just shuts off the ability to manufacture drugs that are biosimilar that already have FDA license. Those kind of things need to go away permanently. And I think if we could get a handle on those things, and I'm counting on our industry partners to be part of that conversation, and I know they have been, and I know they continue to will be. Again, I'm not trying to say that manufacture of pharmaceuticals should be a not-for-profit business. I don't believe that at all. But I do think there are things that go on within some actors in the industry which I think we can all point to and say, that's really unfair. You have exclusivity to manufacture this drug, and because you now have exclusivity, you've chosen to raise the price 60, 100%, and now people can't afford the medication, and that's just got to stop.
Okay, any last questions? All right, well, let's give a round of applause for our speakers. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. We're really glad you could be here. If you want to stick around and talk with our members, we have a few minutes. I'm going to keep pushing this breakfast food, so please take some. You must have a hungry staff or somewhere that's hungry. But thank you again, everyone, for coming. We really appreciate you starting your Friday with us.